It isn't high-tech or smart, it's just a steel box. Yet, the shipping container is the single most important invention of the 20th century. By slashing the cost of moving goods to almost zero, this simple box killed local industry and gave birth to the globalized world. If you want to know why your life looks the way it does, you have to look inside the box. To understand the magnitude of the shipping container's impact, one must first visualize the sheer, chaotic inefficiency of a mid-century waterfront. Before 1956, the global economy was physically constrained by the break-bulk method of shipping. This process had remained fundamentally unchanged since the era of the Phoenicians. It was a world of sacks, bales, barrels, and crates, where every single item had to be handled individually by human hands at every stage of its journey. This chapter examines the grueling physical reality of the pre-container dock and the economic bottleneck that threatened to stifle the post-war industrial boom. In the early 1950s, a typical cargo ship was a labyrinth of holds and decks. When a truck or train arrived at the pier, its contents were unloaded into a transit shed. From there, longshoremen, working in gangs of roughly 20 men, would begin the painstaking process of moving the goods from the shed to the ship's side. The tools of the trade were simple: hand trucks, hooks, and muscle. To get the cargo into the ship, it was often placed onto wooden pallets or into rope slings, which were then hoisted by the ship's own derricks and lowered into the dark recesses of the hull. Once inside, another gang of men had to manhandle each piece of cargo into place, stowing it tightly to ensure it didn't shift during a storm. This process was essentially a high-stakes, manual game of Tetris. If you were shipping a car, it might be parked next to crates of machinery, nestled against bags of coffee, which were stacked on top of barrels of oil. To prevent damage, vast quantities of scrap lumber was used to fill the gaps and brace the cargo. This was not just labor-intensive, it was incredibly slow. A medium-sized vessel carrying 10,000 tons of diverse cargo could easily spend more time sitting at the dock being loaded and unloaded than it spent actually sailing. In many cases, a ship would spend 10 days in port for every 10 days it spent at sea. The economic implications of this logjam were staggering. Because the work was so slow and required such a massive workforce, the cost of stevedoring, the act of loading and unloading, consumed a massive portion of the total freight rate. Experts estimated that the cost of moving a product through the terminal accounted for roughly 50% of the total cost of shipping. In some documented cases, it was more expensive to move a crate from a warehouse in Brooklyn onto a ship in New York Harbor than it was to transport that same crate 3,000 miles across the Atlantic to London. The human cost was equally high. Dock work was among the most dangerous and physically punishing jobs in the industrial world. Men worked in all weather conditions, often in cramped, poorly ventilated holds where heavy crates dangled overhead on fraying ropes. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Furthermore, the break-bulk system was a playground for petty theft. Because goods were handled in small, recognizable units, a box of scotch, a crate of electronics, it was remarkably easy for shrinkage to occur. It was a common joke on the New York docks that a longshoreman's salary was just a supplement to the dividend he took home in his pockets. By the mid-1950s, the maritime industry was reaching a breaking point. While land-based transportation was becoming faster thanks to new highways and diesel engines, the ports remained stuck in the 19th century. The ships themselves were getting faster, but their increased speed was irrelevant if they were forced to sit idle for weeks. This inefficiency acted as a hidden tax on every consumer. It made international trade a luxury, reserved for high-value goods that could absorb the massive handling tax. The world was ready for a revolution, but it wouldn't come from a shipowner, it would come from a man who viewed the ship not as a vessel, but as a temporary extension of a highway. To appreciate the change, one must look at the specific data from the Port of New York, which in 1954 handled nearly 150 million tons of cargo. On any given day, thousands of trucks were backed up for blocks, idling their engines as they waited for a turn to be hand unloaded. The port was a sprawling, decentralized mess of over 700 piers, most too narrow for modern trucks and lacking sorting space. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering that had become a nightmare of modern logistics. This was the world Malcolm McLean observed as he sat in his truck, waiting for cargo to move piece by piece. He didn't see the romance of the sea, he saw a massive, expensive waste of time. This chapter sets the stage for the entry of the steel box. It highlights a critical economic principle. The greatest barrier to global trade wasn't the distance of the oceans, but the last mile at the water's edge. The industrial world had mastered mass production, but it had yet to master mass distribution. The pier-side logjam was the ultimate friction in the machine of capitalism, a bottleneck that kept prices high and markets local. Breaking that logjam would require the total reimagining of what cargo actually was. The transition from manual stowage to containerization would eventually be described by economists as a shift from a labor-intensive industry to a capital-intensive one. But in the early 1950s, that shift seemed impossible. The unions were powerful, shipowners were conservative, and infrastructure was crumbling. The story of the box begins here, in the sweat and confusion of the breakbulk dock, where the cost of a single ton of cargo was measured not just in dollars, but in days of wasted human effort and the physical limits of the human back. To understand why the shipping container was a financial necessity, one must look at the cold mathematics of the 1954 maritime economy. While the United States was a post-war industrial powerhouse, its primary gateway, the Port of New York, was drowning in overhead. The wealth of the old guard was built on a system of manual labor that had become a parasitic drain on commerce. This chapter deconstructs the specific cost accounting nightmare known to economists as the $5.83 problem. In 1954, a study tracked the costs of moving a single ton of cargo through New York. The results shocked the industry. The average cost to load a ton of breakbulk cargo was $5.83. While seemingly modest, this figure represented a massive barrier to trade. More importantly, it only covered labor at the pier, excluding ship idle time, insurance for shrinkage, or landside transport. With a new car costing roughly $2,000, the invisible tax of inefficient loading added hundreds of dollars to every exported good. This figure was a direct result of the gang system. On the docks, work was allocated in 4-hour increments to gangs of 20 men. Because of the complexity of the breakbulk method, these gangs spent significant time simply waiting. They waited for trucks to navigate congested streets, for derricks to be positioned, and for coopers to repair smashed crates. In a 20-man gang, only a few might be active at any given second, yet the payroll ran for all 20. This was the friction of the human element, priced into every product shipped across the Atlantic. This financial bottleneck created a bizarre paradox. Because port costs were so high, it was often cheaper for a factory in New Jersey to ship goods by truck to Chicago than by sea to Europe, even if the sea voyage was technically more efficient once moving. High dock costs acted as a protective tariff for local industries, preventing global competition through logistical incompetence. For Malcolm McLean, a trucking magnate, this $5.83 was an insult to logic. He realized profit was being eaten not by distance, but by the vertical move from the pier to the hold. The problem was compounded by the idle capital of the ships. A vessel is only a productive asset when its propellers turn. In 1954, a standard C2 cargo ship cost about $3,000 per day to operate. Under breakbulk, that ship might spend 12 days in port to load 10,000 tons. This meant the owner paid $36,000 in dead time just to get cargo on board. Combined with labor, the total cost to simply start a journey was nearly $100,000 before burning any fuel for propulsion. The system also fueled institutionalized waste. Because cargo was handled in small units, breakage was factored into every contract. If a crate shattered, it was considered the cost of doing business. Insurance premiums were astronomical because risks were varied. Moisture, theft, and improper stowage were statistical certainties. The unions guarded the gang system for jobs, port authorities guarded piers for fees, and shipowners passed costs to consumers. However, the $5.83 figure provided a clear target for disruption. If a system could move 20 tons in a single lift rather than 20 individual bags, the math would change. Instead of a 20-man gang moving 20 tons an hour, a single crane operator could move 500 tons. The cost per ton would drop to cents. This was the arbitrage of the box. McLean didn't need to invent physics, he just needed to bypass the labor trap by turning the ship into a floating parking lot for his trailers. By 1955, the $5.83 problem was an existential threat. Other ports competed with slightly lower labor rates, but all played the same failing game. The industry was a race to the bottom in labor costs, rather than a race to the top in technology. The stage was set for a radical decoupling of labor from cargo. The $5.83 problem was the fever signaling a dying system. The cure was a standardized steel cell that rendered the gang and the hook obsolete. This chapter highlights that major historical shifts are rarely driven by good ideas alone. They are driven by a desperate need to solve a crushing financial inefficiency. The container didn't win because it was modern. It won because it solved the $5.83 problem. By moving cargo in a sealed unit, McLean moved the world's economic structure out of the longshoreman's hands and into the cranes. The era of wealth built on manual marking of ledgers was ending, replaced by the brutal efficiency of the steel sovereign. To change the world, one often needs the perspective of an outsider. Malcolm McLean was not a shipping man, he was a trucking man. Born in North Carolina during the Great Depression, McLean had built a massive transportation empire from a single second-hand truck. By the mid-1950s, his company, McLean Trucking, was one of the largest in the United States. However, he was increasingly frustrated by the inefficiency of the coastal highways and the logistical nightmare of the piers. This chapter explores the high-stakes gamble of a man who decided to bet his entire fortune on a concept that the maritime establishment considered a fool's errand. McLean's aha moment had actually occurred decades earlier, in 1937, while he sat in his truck at a Jersey City pier. He watched for hours as longshoremen slowly transferred cotton bales from his trailer into the hold of a ship. He realized then that the truck trailer itself was just a box on wheels. If the wheels could be removed and the box lifted directly onto the ship, the entire process of loading and unloading could be bypassed. For 20 years, this idea remained a background thought while he built his trucking business. But by 1955, the growth of his company was being strangled by the very pier-side logjam we explored in Chapter 1. The gamble began with a radical corporate maneuver. Under the regulations of the time, a single company was generally prohibited from owning both a trucking line and a shipping line to prevent monopolies. To bypass this, McLean staged a corporate divorce. He sold his massive stake in McLean Trucking, the company that bore his name and was his primary source of wealth, and used the proceeds to buy a small, struggling shipping firm called Pan Atlantic Steamship Corporation. It was a move that shocked the financial world. He was liquidating a sure thing to buy a company with aging ships and a failing business model. McLean didn't just buy a company, he bought a laboratory. He immediately hired an engineer named Keith Tantlinger to solve the mechanical puzzle of the box. McLean's vision was simple, a standardized container that could be stacked. Tantlinger developed the twist-lock mechanism, a corner casting that allowed a crane to lock onto a container, lift it, and then lock it to the container beneath it on the ship. This was the birth of the modern intermodal system. It meant the box was no longer a piece of cargo, it was a structural component of the ship itself. The risk was not merely technical, but financial and legal. McLean had to convince skeptical banks to lend him millions to convert old World War II tankers into container ships. The maritime industry laughed at him. Traditional ship owners believed that lashing trailers to the deck was dangerous and that the loss of bale space, the empty air between the rectangular boxes and the curved hull, would make the ships unprofitable. They were focused on the efficiency of the voyage, while McLean was focused on the efficiency of the system. To prove his point, McLean chose a converted tanker named the Ideal X. On April 26, 1956, the vessel was docked at Port Newark. It didn't look like the future of global commerce, it looked like a patched-together experiment. On its deck were 58 aluminum truck bodies, their wheels removed, secured to a specially built steel frame. As the cranes began to lift the boxes, a group of curious onlookers and skeptical officials watched from the pier. Among them was a high-ranking official from the Longshoremen's Union. When asked what he thought of the new ship, he reportedly replied, "I'd like to sink that son of a gun." The Ideal X sailed from Newark to Houston, a journey that would change history. When it arrived, the unloading process took a fraction of the time required for a traditional ship. The math was undeniable. McLean had proven that he could move cargo for a fraction of the cost of his competitors. However, the victory was not yet complete. He had proven the technology worked, but he had yet to prove that the world would accept it. He was a man with a few ships and a few hundred boxes in a world built for hooks and sacks. This gamble was the singularity of the shipping world. McLean was operating on a foundation of risk that would have broken most men. He had leveraged everything he owned on the belief that the steel sovereign would eventually dominate the waves. He wasn't just fighting physics, he was fighting a century of maritime tradition and the most powerful labor unions in the country. He knew that if he could hold out long enough for the industry to see the savings, the box would become an unstoppable force. By the end of 1956, the laughter from the maritime establishment was beginning to fade, replaced by a nervous curiosity. McLean had survived the first stage of his gamble. He had successfully decoupled the fortune of shipping from the labor of the dock. The Ideal X was the proof of concept that signaled the end of the breakbulk era. The trucker from North Carolina had successfully invaded the ocean, and the global economy would never be the same. The box was no longer a dream, it was a floating reality heading toward Houston at 15 knots. If Malcolm McLean was the architect of the container revolution, the Ideal X was its first monument. A converted T2 oil tanker from World War II, the vessel was never intended to be a pioneer of global trade. In early 1956, it was simply a piece of surplus capital that McLean had acquired through his purchase of Pan Atlantic. Yet, on April 26, 1956, this ship became the site of a technical and economic demonstration that would render centuries of maritime tradition obsolete. This chapter reconstructs the maiden voyage of the Ideal X, a journey that proved a steel box could do what 1,000 longshoremen could not. The conversion of the Ideal X was an exercise in pragmatic engineering. McLean and Keith Tantlinger knew they couldn't afford to build a purpose-built container ship from scratch. The financial risk was too high. Instead, they installed a spar deck, a raised steel frame, above the main deck of the tanker. This allowed the ship to carry its traditional load of oil in the holds below while carrying the new containers on top. It was a dual-purpose hedge against failure. If the containers proved a disaster, the ship could still function as a standard tanker. This hybrid design was the physical manifestation of McLean's foundation of risk, a bridge between the old world of liquid bulk and the new world of modular freight. On that historic Thursday morning at the port of Newark, the Ideal X sat low in the water. The cargo was not packed in the ship's holds but arrived in 58 aluminum truck bodies, each 35 feet long. In a process that looked alien to traditional dock workers, a large crane began to lift the boxes. There were no rope slings, no wooden pallets, and no manual stowing. The crane simply lowered each box onto the spar deck, where it was secured. The entire loading process for these 58 units took less than 8 hours. To move the same volume of cargo using the breakbulk method would have taken several days and a small army of men. The voyage from Newark to Houston took 6 days. During this time, the Ideal X was more than a ship, it was a floating data point. McLean was tracking everything: the stability of the stack in sea swells, the resistance of the aluminum boxes to salt spray, and the security of the locking mechanisms. When the ship arrived at the port of Houston on May 2nd, the true test began. A waiting crane began the unloading process, placing the containers directly onto waiting truck chassis. Within hours, the cargo was on the highway, heading toward its final destinations. The vertical move had been conquered. The ship had been unloaded at a rate of 30 tons per hour, per crane, a staggering increase over the manual average. The financial data from the Ideal X voyage was the smoking gun that the industry could not ignore. Pan Atlantic reported that the cost of loading the ship was approximately 16 cents per ton. Compare this to the $5.83 per ton average for breakbulk cargo in New York that we analyzed in Chapter 2. In a single voyage, McLean reduced the cost of the most expensive part of shipping by over 97%. This wasn't an incremental improvement, it was a total collapse of the existing cost structure. The Ideal X had proved that the box wasn't just a different way to carry things, it was a different way to calculate wealth. Despite the success, the Ideal X faced immediate pushback from the regulatory and labor establishments. The Interstate Commerce Commission was bombarded with complaints from competing railroads and shipping lines who argued that McLean's low costs were unfair and predatory. Simultaneously, the International Longshoremen's Association began to realize that if one ship could do the work of dozens, their members' livelihoods were at stake. The Ideal X had created a productivity shock that the legal and social systems of 1956 were not prepared to absorb. McLean had the math on his side, but he was now entering a political minefield. The legacy of the Ideal X is often overshadowed by the larger, more modern Megamax ships of today, but it remains the most important vessel in the history of globalization. It broke the psychological barrier of the loose cargo mindset. It proved that intermodalism, the seamless transfer of goods between truck and ship, was not a futurist dream but a functional reality. The ship proved that the container didn't need to be part of the cargo, it was part of the infrastructure. This distinction is what allowed the industry to scale. The box was a tool, like a gear in a watch, and the Ideal X was the first time the watch had been wound. As the Ideal X returned to Newark for its next load, the celestial fortune of the maritime world began to shift. The old piers of Manhattan, with their narrow finger docks and manual labor, suddenly looked like ancient ruins. The future was in Newark, in Houston, and in any port that could provide the flat, open land and massive cranes that the box demanded. The trucker's gamble had paid off. The Ideal X had sailed into the history books not because of its speed or beauty, but because of its brutal, mechanical efficiency. The Steel Sovereign had claimed its first victory, and the era of the hook was officially over. This chapter concludes the proof of concept phase of the container's history. We have seen the problem, the gamble, and the first success. But for the box to truly rule the world, it needed more than one ship and one route. It needed a global language. It needed a standard. The next phase of the story is not about ships or cranes, but about the invisible rules that allow a box from one side of the planet to fit perfectly on a truck on the other. It was time for the standardization wars to begin, where the dimensions of the world would be decided in wood-paneled committee rooms. While the Ideal X proved that the container could sail, it did not yet prove that the container could scale. For Malcolm McLean's vision to become a global reality, the box needed to be more than just a metal shell. It needed to be a precision-engineered tool that could be handled by any crane, on any ship, in any port. The secret to this universality lay not in the walls of the container, but in its corners. This chapter explores the development of the corner casting and the twist lock, the two most important, yet least celebrated, inventions of the modern industrial age. The primary engineering challenge of the early 1950s was how to lift a 30-ton box safely and quickly. Early experiments involved using hooks or massive slings, but these were slow and prone to slipping. McLean tasked his chief engineer, Keith Tantlinger, with finding a way to make the box self-grabbing. Tantlinger's solution was a masterpiece of industrial design, a hollow, cast steel block welded into each of the 8 corners of the container. These blocks, known as corner castings, featured specific oval-shaped apertures. These holes were not for aesthetics, they were the keyholes for the world's most important lock. The key to this system was the twist lock. This was a rotating, spear-shaped head attached to the spreader of a crane. When the crane lowered the spreader onto the container, the twist locks would enter the corner castings. With a 90-degree turn, the heads would rotate inside the casting, locking the spreader to the box with enough strength to lift 40 tons of cargo. This mechanism allowed four-blind attachment. A crane operator, sitting 100 feet in the air, could lock onto a box in seconds without the need for men on the ground to manually secure cables or hooks. However, the corner casting had a second, even more vital function: stacking. In the breakbulk era, stacking was limited by the crush strength of the wooden crates at the bottom of the pile. In the container era, the corner castings acted as the skeleton of the ship. When containers were stacked 10 high, the weight of the top 9 boxes was not carried by the aluminum walls of the bottom box, but by the 4 steel corner castings. This allowed for vertical density that was previously impossible. The twist lock was also used to secure the boxes to each other, turning a stack of independent units into a single, rigid block of steel that could withstand the violent rolling of a ship in a North Atlantic gale. The engineering of the corner casting also solved the intermodal problem. By standardizing the location of these holes, Tantlinger ensured that the same box could be locked onto a ship's deck, a railroad flat car, or a truck chassis. The key fit every lock in the global transport system. This was the moment the shipping container stopped being a maritime asset and became a universal currency of logistics. The fortune of the system was no longer tied to the ship's hull, it was tied to the interface between the machines. If you own the standard for the corner casting, you own the gateway to global trade. Despite the brilliance of Tantlinger's design, there was a major hurdle: intellectual property. McLean's company, Sealand, held the patents for the corner casting and the twist lock. For the industry to adopt this as a global standard, McLean would have to do something unthinkable for a cutthroat entrepreneur. He would have to give his patents away for free. He realized that if he kept the technology proprietary, his competitors would develop their own versions, creating a fragmented market of incompatible boxes. To win the standardization wars, he had to surrender the cornerstone of his empire to the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. This act of patent philanthropy was perhaps McLean's most brilliant move. By releasing the corner casting to the world, he ensured that every crane built in the next 50 years would be designed to fit his system. He traded the short-term profit of licensing fees for the long-term dominance of a global standard. The ISO 668 and ISO 1161 standards, which define the dimensions and the strength of the corner casting, remain the most strictly enforced rules in international commerce. A box that is off by even a few millimeters in its corner casting is a box that cannot be shipped. The corner casting also represented a shift in the nature of skill on the waterfront. The longshoreman's hook, which required years of physical intuition to master, was replaced by the twist lock, which required mechanical precision and software integration. The dock was becoming a machine, and the corner casting was its primary gear. This transition was the final nail in the coffin for the breakbulk era. The steel sovereign was now literally locked into the global infrastructure. The wealth was no longer in the hands that moved the goods, but in the standards that allowed the goods to move. In the decades since, the corner casting hasn't changed. While ships have grown from carrying 58 boxes to 24,000, and cranes have become fully automated robots, they all still rely on that same oval hole and that same 90-degree twist. It is a rare example of a technology that was perfected on the first try. Tantlinger's engineering ensured that the box was not just a container, but a module. This chapter highlights that the greatest revolutions are often found in the smallest details. The shipping container changed the world, but it was the corner casting that allowed it to hold that world together. By the late 1950s, the maritime industry realized that the container was inevitable, but the industry was far from a consensus on what that container should look like. This period, known as the Standardization Wars, was a high-stakes conflict played out in committee rooms rather than on the high seas. At stake was the celestial fortune of the global transport network. If one company's specific dimensions became the law of the land, every other competitor would be forced to scrap their fleets and start over. This chapter examines the invisible struggle to define the dimensions of the world. The primary combatants were Malcolm McLean's Sealand and the West Coast giant, Matson Navigation Company. McLean had built his empire on a 35-foot container, a length dictated by the trucking laws of the eastern United States. Matson, meanwhile, had optimized its Pacific routes for a 24-foot container, which better suited the weight of canned pineapple and sugar coming from Hawaii. Both companies had invested tens of millions of dollars in ships, cranes, and chassis specifically designed for their proprietary sizes. To adopt a universal standard meant one side, or both, would have to accept a massive sunk cost fallacy. The chaos of the era was a nightmare for logistics. A 35-foot Sealand box could not fit on a Matson ship, and neither could fit on the experimental 17-foot trailers being tested by Grace Line. Railroads, which were used to carrying 40-foot flat cars, were equally resistant to these odd sizes. The lack of a universal language meant that the true power of the container, intermodalism, was being strangled by corporate ego. Without a standard, the box was just a better way to load a specific ship. With a standard, it could become a global system. In 1958, the American Standards Association, ASA, formed a committee to resolve the deadlock. The negotiations were brutal. The committee included representatives from the Navy, the railroads, trucking companies, and rival shipping lines. The Navy demanded a size that fit its logistics for a potential land war in Europe, while the railroads demanded sizes that matched their existing rolling stock. The shipping lines, meanwhile, fought to protect their specific infrastructure. It was a zero-sum game where the winner would dictate the architecture of 20th-century commerce. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the United States government. The Maritime Administration announced that it would only provide subsidies and construction loans for ships designed to carry standardized containers. This turned the theoretical debate into a financial survival struggle. The committee eventually settled on the lengths we know today: 10, 20, 30, and 40 feet. The height and width were fixed at 8 feet by 8 feet. This was a devastating blow to McLean, whose 35-foot fleet was now officially non-standard, and to Matson, whose 24-foot boxes were rendered obsolete for international trade. However, the war wasn't just about length, it was about the interface. As discussed in the previous chapter, the corner casting was the ultimate prize. In 1961, after years of bickering, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, met in New York and Geneva to elevate the American standards to a global level. The European delegates were initially skeptical, fearing American industrial dominance, but the sheer mathematical efficiency of the proposed system won out. The ISO standard was ratified, and for the first time in history, the world agreed on the size of a unit of trade. The cost of this victory was enormous. Companies that had pioneered containerization were forced to undergo a great retooling. McLean had to spend millions modifying his ships to accommodate 40-foot boxes alongside his 35-footers. Yet, this standardization unlocked a network effect that saw the volume of containerized trade explode. Once the standard was set, banks felt safe lending the billions of dollars required for massive new port terminals. The box was no longer a risky experiment, it was a safe, standardized asset. The standardization wars illustrate a fundamental law of modern economics. The most powerful technology is not the one that is best, but the one that everyone agrees to use. By settling on the 20-foot and 40-foot standards, the TEU and FEU, the committee created the digital bit of physical trade. Just as a computer doesn't care if a bit represents a letter or a number, a container ship doesn't care if a box contains iPhones or iron ore. The standard had successfully decoupled the cargo from the transport, turning the world's oceans into a seamless, automated conveyor belt. This chapter concludes with the irony of standardization. By agreeing to a universal size, the shipping lines gave up their ability to compete on service or specialization. They turned themselves into a commodity. The fortune would no longer go to the company with the best box, but to the company that could move the standard box at the lowest possible cost. The standardization wars ended the era of the inventor and began the era of the economies of scale. The rules of the game were finally written. Now, the world was about to see who could play it the fastest. If the container was an engineering triumph, it was a social catastrophe for the men who worked the docks. For decades, the fortune of the waterfront was built on the necessity of human muscle. In ports like New York, London, and San Francisco, the labor unions, most notably the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, and the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, held immense power. They controlled the supply of labor in an industry that, until 1956, could not function without it. This chapter examines the violent and complex struggle between the steel sovereign and the men whose livelihoods it threatened to erase. The central conflict was featherbedding. the practice of requiring more workers than necessary for a task to preserve jobs. To the unions, the container was not progress, it was a job killer. In the breakbulk era, a ship required hundreds of men working for a week. A container ship required a handful of men for a few hours. The math was simple and terrifying for the rank-and-file dock worker. One container crane could replace roughly 20 to 30 gangs of men. By the early 1960s, as the ISO standards were being finalized, the tension on the docks had reached a boiling point. The question was no longer if the box would take over, but who would pay the price for the transition. In the port of New York, the ILA took a hardline stance. They viewed the container as a violation of their hard-won rights. Strikes became frequent and increasingly bitter. The union demanded that any container packed or unpacked within 50 miles of the port be handled by ILA members, even if it had already been packed at a factory. This became known as the 50-mile rule. It was a desperate attempt to keep the manual in a world going mechanical. The ship owners, desperate to see a return on their massive investments in container ships, fought back through the courts, leading to decades of litigation that reached the Supreme Court. On the West Coast, the approach was different. Harry Bridges, the legendary and controversial leader of the ILWU, was a realist. He saw the box as an unstoppable technological tide. Rather than trying to hold back the ocean, he decided to sell the union's right to restrict productivity in exchange for security. This led to the landmark 1960 Mechanization and Modernization (M&M) agreement. In this historic deal, the shipowners agreed to pay millions of dollars into a fund that guaranteed longshoremen's wages and provided early retirement benefits. In exchange, the union agreed to stop fighting the introduction of containers and cranes. The M&M agreement was a social contract for the industrial age. It acknowledged that while technology would destroy jobs, the wealth created by that technology should be used to protect the workers being displaced. It was a radical idea that allowed the West Coast ports to modernize decades faster than their East Coast counterparts. However, it came at a psychological cost. The pride of the hook, the status of being a skilled stower who knew how to pack a ship's hull, was replaced by the monotony of being a checker or a machine operator. The waterfront was being de-skilled, and the vibrant, chaotic culture of the docks began to vanish. The battle also had a darker side. As the old jobs disappeared, the remaining jobs became even more valuable, leading to increased corruption and racketeering. In some ports, the container became a new vehicle for smuggling and skimming. Since the boxes were sealed, it was harder to steal a single bottle of scotch, but it was easier to divert an entire 40-foot container of electronics if you controlled the paperwork. The gray gold of the docks didn't disappear, it just changed its ledger. The struggle for control over the digital bit of trade was just as fierce as the struggle over the manual sacks. By the late 1960s, the outcome was clear. The productivity gains of the container were so vast that no union could stop them indefinitely. A ship that once cost $5.83 per ton to load, as we saw in Chapter 2, was now being loaded for pennies. Even after paying out millions in union automation fees, the shipowners were making more profit than ever before. The fortune had shifted from the labor of many to the capital of a few. The dock worker, once the king of the waterfront, was becoming a peripheral figure in an automated system. This chapter highlights a recurring theme in the history of the box. Technology does not exist in a vacuum. It interacts with human systems, laws, and power structures. The battle of the unions was the friction of the old world grinding against the new. While the container eventually won, the scars of this transition defined the labor politics of the 20th century. The box had successfully industrialized the ocean, but it had also dehumanized the dock. With the labor problems solved through payouts and automation, the industry was finally ready to move to the next stage, finding a port that was big enough to hold the future. For centuries, the geography of wealth was dictated by the depth of a natural harbor and the proximity to a city center. Ports like San Francisco, Manhattan, and London were the undisputed titans of trade because they were built where the people were. But the container changed the requirements of land. The box didn't need narrow piers or bustling city streets. It needed vast, flat, industrial acreage and high-speed road access. This chapter tells the story of the Port of Oakland, a sleepy, secondary harbor that became a global powerhouse by betting on the steel sovereign while its famous neighbor across the bay remained trapped in the past. In the early 1960s, San Francisco was the queen of the Pacific. Its waterfront was a dense thicket of finger piers designed for the breakbulk era. However, San Francisco's success was also its greatest weakness. The city was physically constrained by hills and expensive real estate. There was no room to store thousands of 40-foot containers or to build the massive, heavy-duty cranes required to lift them. Furthermore, the streets leading to the piers were narrow and congested, trucking nightmares in a world moving toward high-speed logistics. San Francisco city officials, blinded by their historical dominance, viewed the container as a niche technology that would never fully replace traditional shipping. Across the bay, the city of Oakland saw a different future. Oakland had something San Francisco lacked: space. It possessed vast tracts of underutilized marshland and industrial territory adjacent to the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1962, a visionary port director named Ben Nutter realized that if Oakland built a dedicated container terminal, it could steal the entire Pacific trade from San Francisco. It was a massive financial risk. Oakland didn't have the celestial fortune of a world-famous skyline. It had to build its fortune from the mud up. The Oakland experiment began with the construction of the 7th Street Terminal. This was not a pier, but a massive, reinforced concrete apron capable of supporting the immense weight of container stacks and 500-ton cranes. Oakland designed its terminal for the intermodal age, ensuring that a container could move from a ship's deck to a railcar in minutes. They worked closely with Matson Navigation and Sealand, offering them customized facilities that San Francisco simply could not provide. The message was clear: Oakland was building a machine for trade, while San Francisco was maintaining a museum. The results were instantaneous and brutal. In 1962, Oakland handled virtually no container traffic. By 1968, it was the second-largest container port in the world, trailing only New York. Shipowners realized that the time saved by docking in Oakland, where a ship could be turned around in 24 hours instead of a week, far outweighed the prestige of docking in San Francisco. One by one, the great shipping lines abandoned the Queen of the Pacific. San Francisco's waterfront, once the heart of the city's economy, began a slow, painful decline, eventually transitioning from a center of trade to a center of tourism and real estate. The Oakland experiment proved a new economic law: infrastructure dictates destiny. In the container age, a port's value was no longer measured by its history, but by its throughput. Oakland's success forced a global reckoning. From Tokyo to Rotterdam, port authorities realized they had to move their operations away from historic city centers and toward greenfield sites with rail and highway access. This led to the creation of the satellite port, industrial zones that operated almost entirely independently of the cities they served. The port was no longer a part of the city, it was a node in a global network. However, this shift also had social consequences. The Port of Oakland became a highly automated, fenced-off industrial fortress. The vibrant connection between the city and its waterfront was severed. In the old days, the dock was a place where thousands of men from the local community worked. In the new Oakland, the work was done by a few hundred specialized crane operators and clerks. The wealth generated by the port stayed in the global system, while the local neighborhoods often saw little but the pollution and traffic of the thousands of trucks moving through their streets. The success of Oakland also signaled the end of port competition based on labor rates. Now, ports competed on technical specifications. Did you have a 50-foot channel depth? Did you have post-Panamax cranes? Did you have a direct rail link to the interior? Oakland's gamble had changed the barrier to entry for global trade. To be a player in the new world, a city had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on specialized concrete and steel. The steel sovereign required a throne, and Oakland was the first city to build one. This chapter highlights the creative destruction of the container era. Oakland's rise and San Francisco's fall were not accidents of fate, they were the direct result of how each city responded to the box. The fortune of the Bay shifted in less than a decade, proving that in the face of radical technological change, tradition is a liability and space is the ultimate asset. With the Oakland model proven, the container was ready for its next great challenge, proving it could handle the logistical demands of a global superpower at war. In the mid-1960s, the shipping container faced its ultimate stress test not in a commercial port, but on the beaches of Southeast Asia. As the United States rapidly escalated its involvement in the Vietnam War, it encountered a logistical nightmare that threatened to stall the entire military effort. The fortune of the world's most powerful military was being squandered by an archaic supply chain that couldn't handle the sheer volume of modern warfare. This chapter explores how Malcolm McLean's box saved the U.S. military from a logistical collapse and, in doing so, secured the container's future as the global standard. By 1965, the port of Saigon was a scene of total pandemonium. The U.S. was attempting to fight a high-tech war using 19th-century breakbulk methods. Hundreds of ships sat idle in the South China Sea, waiting weeks or even months for their turn to unload. On the docks, thousands of individual crates of ammunition, rations, and spare parts were piled in the mud, often unlabeled or rotting in the tropical humidity. Theft was rampant, and the last mile of the supply chain, getting goods from the ship to the soldier in the jungle, was broken. The military was paralyzed by its own weight. It could manufacture goods at an incredible rate, but it could not move them. The Pentagon's logistical experts were desperate. They turned to Malcolm McLean, who saw an opportunity to prove his system on the largest possible stage. McLean proposed a total logistics solution. He would build a dedicated container terminal at Cam Ranh Bay and provide a fleet of ships to run a regular shuttle service from the U.S. West Coast. The military was initially skeptical, fearing that specialized container cranes would be easy targets for sabotage or that the system was too rigid for a war zone. But with the pier-side logjam in Saigon reaching catastrophic proportions, the Army gave Sealand the contract in 1967. The impact was immediate. A single Sealand container ship could carry the equivalent of 10 traditional cargo ships and be unloaded in a fraction of the time. More importantly, the container provided a mobile warehouse. Instead of unloading crates onto the ground, the containers remained sealed until they reached their final destination. A container filled with frozen meat could stay refrigerated on the dock, and a container of artillery shells could be moved directly onto a truck without ever being touched by human hands. The gray gold of military supplies was finally protected from the elements and the black market. Vietnam was the proof of concept for the just-in-time economy. The military learned that it didn't need to keep massive stockpiles of goods in country if it could rely on a high-speed, predictable pipeline of containers. This shift from push logistics, sending everything and hoping for the best, to pull logistics, sending exactly what was needed when it was needed, saved the U.S. government billions of dollars. It also provided McLean with a massive, guaranteed revenue stream that allowed him to build the world's first truly global container network. However, the most significant legacy of the Vietnam supply chain was what happened on the backhaul. McLean realized that his ships were returning to the United States empty, which was a massive waste of potential fortune. He began to look for commercial cargo in the region to fill those empty boxes. He stopped his ships in Japan on the way back from Vietnam, offering Japanese manufacturers incredibly low rates to ship their electronics and cars to the American market. This was the spark that ignited the Asian export miracle. The container didn't just fuel the war, it built the bridge for the Made in Japan era. By the end of the conflict, the U.S. military had become the world's largest proponent of containerization. The Battle of the Sacks had been won by the steel sovereign. The logistical success in Vietnam convinced the rest of the world's navies and commercial shipping lines that the box was not a fad, but a fundamental shift in the nature of power. If it could survive the jungles and the chaos of a war zone, it could survive anything. The standard was no longer just a commercial agreement, it was a military necessity. The Vietnam era also highlighted the invisible nature of the box. To the soldiers on the ground, the container was just a background object, a metal hut used for storage or a temporary office. They didn't see the complex web of global engineering and finance that brought it there. This anonymity of the box would become its defining characteristic. As the war ended, the infrastructure McLean built for the military was pivoted entirely toward global trade, setting the stage for the massive industrialization of the Pacific Rim. This chapter concludes with a fundamental realization: war is often the greatest catalyst for logistical innovation. The Vietnam pipeline proved that the container could handle industrialized distance at a scale never before imagined. The box had successfully moved from a regional experiment in New Jersey to a global strategic asset. With the military's blessing and the Asian backhaul established, the container was now ready to dismantle the traditional industrial heartlands of the West and move the world's factories to the East. If the Port of Oakland was the birth of a new era, the London docklands were the graveyard of the old. For centuries, London was the commercial capital of the world, and its East End was the engine room. The Pool of London and the massive enclosed docks, the Royal Docks, West India, and Millwall, were masterpieces of 19th-century engineering. They were the fortune of empire, a place where the world's wealth was unloaded by a workforce of over 30,000 men. This chapter examines the creative destruction of the container as it moved up the Thames, effectively erasing an entire industrial culture in less than a decade. The problem for London was purely architectural. The London docks were built for the breakbulk age. They were deep inside the city, protected by massive lock gates designed to keep the tide out. The surrounding streets were a maze of narrow Victorian alleys, perfect for horse-drawn wagons but impossible for 40-foot articulated lorries. When the container arrived, London's docks became a massive, locked-in liability. The steel sovereign demanded deep water and hundreds of acres of open concrete for stacking, things the historic East End simply could not provide. The sheer physical footprint of a modern container yard made the cramped, historic jetties of central London look like relics of a bygone civilization. In 1966, the Port of London Authority, PLA, realized that the city centre docks were doomed. To survive, they had to move. They chose a site 20 miles downstream at Tilbury. It was a greenfield location with plenty of space and deep water, far removed from the congested heart of the city. But moving the port meant moving the fortune. As Tilbury grew, the historic docks in the East End began to wither. In 1967, the East India Dock closed. By 1981, every single one of the great enclosed docks in London was shut down. The silence that fell over the once deafening waterfront was eerie, marking the end of London's identity as a working river port. The social impact was a tidal wave of unemployment and decay. For generations, the East End had been a dockocracy. Families lived in the shadow of the cranes, and the work was passed from father to son. When the docks closed, the heartbeat of the community stopped. The local economy, built on the manual marking of ledgers and the physical stowage of goods, collapsed. The East End went from being the busiest trading hub on earth to a landscape of rusted cranes and stagnant water, a literal ghost town in the middle of a global capital. The transformation was so absolute that by the mid-1970s, many observers believed the East End would never recover, its social fabric torn apart by the sudden disappearance of the only industry it had ever known. The death of the East End was not just about jobs, it was about the industrialization of distance. The container allowed the port to be detached from the city. In the old days, the city was the port. The sailors, the merchants, and the workers all lived in the same ecosystem. The container turned the port into an inland terminal, a sterile, fenced-off industrial zone that required no connection to the local culture. Tilbury didn't need London, it only needed the highway. This decoupling is what allowed globalism to accelerate, as the friction of the city was removed from the movement of goods. However, the death of the old docks paved the way for a new kind of fortune. By the 1980s, the derelict docklands were reclaimed for the information age. The massive warehouses were torn down to make way for Canary Wharf, a new financial district that would eventually rival the City of London. The grey gold of physical trade was replaced by the invisible gold of global finance. The very ground where men once struggled with sacks of sugar and bales of wool became the foundation for high-frequency trading and digital banking. The container had moved the physical trade downstream, leaving the center of the city free to become a playground for capital. The London experience was mirrored in cities across the globe. From Manhattan's west side to the piers of Liverpool and Brooklyn, the steel sovereign acted as a catalyst for urban gentrification. The container forced the messy reality of trade out of sight, leaving behind prime waterfront real estate that was eventually converted into luxury lofts and office towers. The box didn't just change how we ship, it changed where we live. It effectively cleaned the modern city of its industrial origins, moving the gears of the world to obscure, anonymous coastal sites. This chapter concludes with the irony of the container's impact on London. The box destroyed the historic port to save the global economy. By moving to Tilbury and standardizing the flow of goods, Britain remained a player in international trade, even as its historic maritime culture was dismantled. The death of the East End was the price paid for the efficiency of the box. The longshoreman's hook was finally traded for the developer's blueprint. With the old ports cleared and the new terminals established, the stage was set for the final piece of the puzzle, the corporate consolidation that would create the mega majors of the sea. By the early 1970s, Malcolm McLean's Sealand was the undisputed leader of the container revolution, but the company now faced a new, existential threat, its own success. The steel sovereign had become too big for one company to control. As the ISO standards were adopted globally, the arbitrage of the box shifted from a niche trucking innovation to a brutal game of global capital. This chapter examines the corporate warfare that erupted as established shipping lines, governments, and massive conglomerates scrambled to seize the celestial fortune that McLean had unearthed. The competition was no longer just about who had the best ships, but who had the most integrated network. European and Japanese shipping giants, such as Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and NYK, had finally overcome their initial skepticism. They began investing billions into second-generation container ships that were twice the size of McLean's converted tankers. These companies had deep pockets and, in many cases, direct backing from their national governments. McLean, the self-made trucker, found himself in a high-stakes poker game against the old money of the maritime world. He was no longer just fighting the $5.83 problem. He was fighting for the survival of the company that had started it all. In a move that surprised the industry, McLean decided to go for the throat. In 1969, he ordered the construction of the SL-7s, the fastest, most technologically advanced cargo ships ever built. These vessels could cross the Atlantic at 33 knots, nearly double the speed of conventional ships. McLean believed that speed was the ultimate competitive advantage. If he could deliver goods faster than anyone else, he could command a premium price. However, this was a massive gamble. The SL-7s were oil hogs, consuming vast amounts of fuel to maintain their incredible speeds. When the 1973 oil crisis hit and fuel prices skyrocketed, McLean's fast ship strategy turned from a masterstroke into a financial anchor. The pressure forced a historic consolidation. The shipping world realized that the box had turned their industry into a utility. To survive, companies had to merge to achieve economies of scale. This era saw the birth of the mega-alliances, where former rivals began sharing space on each other's ships to ensure that no vessel ever sailed half-empty. The container had effectively commoditized the ocean. The unique identity of a shipping line mattered less than its ability to provide a standardized unit of transport at the lowest possible cost. McLean's Sealand, once the sole pioneer, was now just one player in an increasingly crowded and cutthroat global market. The corporate struggle also revealed the dark side of the container's efficiency. Because it was now so cheap to move goods, companies began to look for the absolute cheapest places to manufacture them. The Sealand versus the world conflict wasn't just happening in boardrooms, it was manifesting in the shuttering of factories in the American Midwest and the north of England. The box had become the ultimate tool of deindustrialization in the West and industrialization in the East. McLean had built the bridge, and now the entire world was crossing it, often leaving the original architect behind. Ultimately, the financial strain of the SL-7s and the intense global competition led McLean to sell Sealand to R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco giant, in 1969. Although he remained at the helm for a time, the trucker's gamble had officially entered the era of corporate conglomerate management. The vision of a single man had been absorbed into the machinery of global finance. McLean would eventually leave Sealand to try and start over with a new venture, United States Lines, but the world had changed. The steel sovereign no longer belonged to him, it belonged to the global network. This chapter highlights the inevitable arc of disruptive technology. The pioneer creates the market, but the giant eventually owns it. McLean's genius was in recognizing the potential of the box, but the fortune was so vast that it required the resources of nations and global corporations to fully realize. Sealand's struggle against the world was the final act of the entrepreneurial phase of containerization. The rules of the game were now set in stone, and the focus shifted from innovation to massiveness. The era of the 100,000-ton ship and the fully automated port was just over the horizon. With McLean's original company now a part of a larger corporate machine, the box began its final expansion into every corner of the planet. It was no longer a question of whether a product would be containerized, but how quickly. The steel sovereign had successfully colonized the global economy, turning the planet into a single, interconnected factory floor. The final chapters of our story will look at the ultimate result of this revolution, the world that the box built, and the hidden costs of the seamless, just-in-time reality we inhabit today. The shipping container's greatest trick was making the world forget it was there. By the mid-1970s, the steel sovereign had achieved a ubiquity that rendered it almost invisible, but its most profound impact was not found in the metal box itself. Instead, it was found in the intermodal philosophy, the radical idea that a ship, a train, and a truck were not separate modes of transport, but merely different gears in a single, global machine. This chapter explores the unification of the world's transportation silos and the birth of a logistics network that decoupled the move from the vehicle. Before the intermodal revolution, the transportation industry was a collection of fragmented kingdoms. Shipping lines, railroads, and trucking companies operated in isolation, often viewing one another with deep-seated suspicion. Each had its own specialized equipment, its own labor unions, and its own complex set of government regulations. If you wanted to move a crate of machinery from a factory in Ohio to a warehouse in Birmingham, England, you were essentially engaging in 3 separate legal and physical transactions. The cargo would be loaded onto a truck, unloaded at a rail yard, reloaded onto a train, unloaded at a pier, and finally stowed into a ship's hold. Every transfer was a friction point where costs tripled, theft occurred, and damage was a statistical certainty. Intermodalism erased these borders by standardizing the interface. The twist lock and corner casting became the universal language that allowed these disparate industries to communicate. For the first time in history, the unit of trade was the same for a crane operator in Singapore as it was for a truck driver in New Jersey. This was the moment that shipping ceased to be a maritime activity and became a continuous, high-speed conveyor belt that simply happened to cross water. The container was no longer cargo, it was a modular component of the global infrastructure. The technical linchpin of this revolution arrived in the late 1970s with the invention of the double-stack railcar. For decades, railroads had struggled to compete with the rising efficiency of container ships. A standard flat car could only carry 1 or 2 containers, limited by tunnel heights and weight capacities. However, engineers realized that since containers were designed to be stacked high on ships, the same principle could be applied to land. By lowering the well of the railcar so the bottom container sat just inches above the tracks, they could stack a second container on top. This was a mathematical earthquake. A single double-stack train could now carry over 200 containers, effectively doubling capacity without adding a single foot of length. This created the land bridge concept. Shipping lines realized it was often faster and cheaper to drop containers at the port of Los Angeles and rail them across North America to New York than to sail through the Panama Canal. The continent itself became part of the ocean's trade route. This efficiency drove the cost of inland transport down so far that the geographic distance between a factory and its customer effectively disappeared. This unification turned logistics into a game of pure information management. As physical barriers fell, the fortune shifted from those who owned the hardware to those who controlled the software. The industry began to speak of door-to-door service rather than peer-to-peer. This shift forced traditional shipping lines to reinvent themselves as total logistics providers, owning fleets of trucks and leasing entire rail networks to ensure the box never stopped moving. However, the intermodal revolution also created a new kind of industrial fragility. Because the system was now so tightly integrated, a failure in one node, a rail strike in Chicago or a crane breakdown in Rotterdam, could trigger a cascading delay felt thousands of miles away. We were building a just-in-time world where inventory was replaced by transit. The warehouse didn't disappear, it just started moving at 60 miles per hour on a set of tracks. The slop that once existed in the old system was gone, replaced by a brutal mechanical precision. This chapter highlights the reality that the container's victory was a victory of coordination over craft. The longshoreman, the teamster, and the rail worker were now all cogs in the same machine. This integration effectively broke the power of local unions to hold individual ports hostage, as the intermodal system allowed shipping lines to simply reroute boxes with the click of a mouse. The steel sovereign had successfully colonized the land, turning the interior of continents into extensions of the sea. As the 1980s progressed, the intermodal machine reached global equilibrium. The fortune was no longer found in the individual move, but in the network effect. The more containers there were, the more rail lines were built. The more rail lines were built, the cheaper it became to ship, and the cheaper it became to ship, the more the world's factories began to migrate. The intermodal revolution provided the physical plumbing for the modern world, setting the stage for the massive industrial shifts that would soon define the end of the 20th century. Malcolm McLean had finally seen his 1937 dream realized in full. The truck trailer had shed its wheels, climbed onto a ship, jumped onto a train, and returned to the highway, all without a single human hand ever touching the goods inside. The world was now a single factory floor, and the box was the only currency that mattered. If the container was the engine of globalization, East Asia was its primary beneficiary. In the 1970s and 1980s, a group of nations known as the Asian Tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, recognized that the box had fundamentally leveled the global playing field. By eliminating the handling tax of the old, inefficient ports, the container allowed these nations to leverage their lower labor costs to flood Western markets with manufactured goods. This chapter explores how the steel sovereign collapsed the Pacific Ocean and fueled the most rapid industrialization in human history. For centuries, geography was destiny. Nations far from the traditional centers of consumption in Europe and North America were trapped by the high cost of distance. Shipping a television from Seoul to New York in 1950 would have been a logistical nightmare of breakage, theft, and exorbitant freight rates. But Malcolm McLean's invention changed the math of the planet. Once the containerized pipeline was established, the cost of moving a ton of cargo across 10,000 miles of ocean dropped to near insignificance. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast barrier, became a high-speed liquid highway. The Asian Tigers understood something the declining industrial centers of the West did not. In the container age, a nation's wealth is directly tied to its throughput. While the Port of New York was mired in labor disputes and the East End of London was rotting away, the Tigers were building massive, state-of-the-art container terminals. Singapore and Hong Kong, in particular, reinvented themselves as global transshipment hubs. They weren't just ports, they were massive mechanical sorting machines designed to process millions of TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units, with surgical precision. This infrastructure enabled the Asian export miracle. Manufacturers in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea could now build massive factories near these ports, knowing that their products could reach a shelf in a Chicago department store within weeks, perfectly preserved and at a fraction of the traditional cost. The box allowed for the fragmentation of production. A product could be designed in California, its semiconductors fabricated in Taiwan, its casing molded in Korea, and its final assembly completed in Japan. This was the birth of the global supply chain, a system where the physical location of a factory became less important than its proximity to a container crane. The impact on the global fortune was absolute. The gray gold that once flowed through western piers was now being minted in the shipyards of Ulsan and the terminals of Kaohsiung. As the volume of trade exploded, the Asian tigers saw their GDP skyrocket. South Korea, which had been a war-torn agrarian society in the 1950s, became a global leader in shipbuilding and electronics. Taiwan transformed from an island of small-scale agriculture into the world's high-tech foundry. These nations didn't just adopt the container, they mastered the arbitrage of the box, using it to bypass the industrial middleman and speak directly to the Western consumer. However, this shift created a profound economic dislocation in the West. The same efficiency that built the skyline of Hong Kong began to dismantle the factories of the American Midwest and the north of England. The container had become the ultimate tool of deindustrialization for the established powers. If it cost essentially nothing to ship a box from the other side of the world, a factory in Ohio paying union wages could no longer compete with a factory in Taiwan. The steel sovereign was indifferent to national borders or social contracts. It sought only the path of least resistance and lowest cost. By the mid-1980s, the container had successfully shifted the center of gravity of the global industrial complex from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was the era of Made in Japan and Made in Taiwan, labels that were only possible because of the standardized steel cell. The tigers had proven that the container wasn't just a better way to move things, it was a way to move an entire civilization up the value chain. They had turned their lack of natural resources into a strength by becoming the masters of industrialized distance. This chapter highlights that the Asian tigers didn't win because they had better ideas, but because they built better docks. They embraced the logic of the box while the West was still trying to protect the logic of the gang in the hook. The celestial fortune had migrated east, and the Pacific was now the busiest body of water on the planet. But as the volume of trade grew, so did the size of the ships required to carry it. The industry was about to enter a new engineering arms race, one that would challenge the very geography of the Earth itself. As the 1990s approached, the tigers had set the stage for an even larger player to enter the game, the sleeping giant of China. But before that could happen, the maritime world had to solve a physical problem. The ships were becoming so large that they could no longer fit through the world's most famous shortcut. The era of the Panamax was ending, and the era of the post-Panamax was about to begin, forcing the world to redraw its maps once again. For nearly a century, the dimensions of global trade were dictated by a single strip of water, the Panama Canal. Completed in 1914, the canal's locks, measuring 1,000 feet long and 110 feet wide, established the Panamax standard. Any ship larger than these dimensions was effectively cut off from the world's most vital shortcut, forced to endure the treacherous 8,000-mile detour around Cape Horn. But as the arbitrage of the box matured in the 1990s, the maritime industry reached a tipping point. The relentless drive for economies of scale finally collided with the physical limits of geography. This chapter explores the engineering arms race to build ships too big for the canal and the resulting redraw of logistical maps. The economic logic of the container is brutal. The larger the vessel, the lower the cost per TEU. A ship carrying 1,000 containers requires nearly the same fuel, crew, and insurance as one carrying 2,000. By doubling capacity, a shipping line could nearly halve operating costs per unit. By the late 1980s, the industry had perfected the Panamax vessel, squeezing every possible inch out of the canal's locks to carry roughly 4,500 containers. However, the Asian tigers produced goods at such a staggering volume that even these giants were insufficient. To capture the next tier of celestial fortune, shipowners had to make a choice: remain shackled to the Panama Canal or break the standard and go post-Panamax. In 1988, American President Lines, APL, made the definitive move, commissioning the first 5 post-Panamax vessels. These ships were 129 feet wide, too broad for the Panama locks, but capable of carrying significantly more cargo with greater stability. It was a declaration of independence. The industry realized that the land bridge across the U.S. had become so efficient that the Panama Canal was no longer the only way to move goods from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The steel sovereign had outgrown its own cradle. This engineering shift triggered a global infrastructure crisis. It wasn't just the canal that was obsolete, it was the ports. A post-Panamax ship required deeper channels, longer berths, and larger cranes. The outreach of existing cranes could not reach the far side of these wider vessels. Port authorities faced an existential ultimatum: spend billions to dredge harbors and replace cranes, or be relegated to the status of a secondary feeder port. The post-Panamax era turned competition into a game of depth and reach. If you couldn't handle the giants, they would simply find another throne. The ships continued to swell. In 1996, Maersk introduced the Regina Maersk, capable of carrying over 6,000 TEUs. By the mid-2000s, the Emma Maersk shattered records with a capacity of 14,500 TEUs. These were no longer just ships, they were floating industrial zones, longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. These vessels could only dock at a handful of ports, creating a hub-and-spoke system. Megaships traveled between transshipment hubs like Singapore, while smaller feeder ships distributed boxes to regional ports. The box had not just standardized cargo, it was now standardizing the global coastline. This obsession with scale created a new economic gravity. Because these ships were so expensive, only the largest shipping lines could afford them. This led to the consolidation of the industry into the mega majors, global alliances controlling the vast majority of capacity. The trucker's gamble of Malcolm McLean had evolved into a trillion-dollar oligarchy where vessel size was the ultimate barrier to entry. The fortune was now reserved for those who could command the most massive pieces of floating capital. However, the post-Panamax era also exposed fragility. These massive ships took longer to load, creating vessel bunching at terminals. When a single 20,000 TEU ship arrived, it overwhelmed local trucking and rail capacity, creating temporary paralysis. The industry built a system efficient on the open ocean but increasingly prone to port congestion at the nodes. The steel sovereign was so powerful that it was beginning to choke on its own success. The final irony was that the Panama Canal was eventually forced to surrender. Seeing its relevance slip away, Panama embarked on a massive, $5 billion expansion. Completed in 2016, the new Neo-Panamax locks were built to accommodate the giants. But by the time the ribbon was cut, the industry had moved further ahead, building ultra-large container vessels, ULCVs, still too big for the new locks. The engineering race has no finish line, the box will always demand more space and more depth. In the world of the container, scale is strategy. By breaking the Panama Standard, the industry decoupled itself from 19th-century engineering and embraced infinite expansion. We have reached a point where ships represent a concentration of risk as much as profit. As we will see, when these giants encounter a problem, whether a trade imbalance or a physical blockage, the entire world feels the shockwave. The shipping container was designed to be the perfect vessel for global trade, but its very efficiency created a bizarre economic phenomenon, the ghost of the empty box. In a world of perfectly balanced commerce, every container leaving Shanghai full of electronics would return from Los Angeles full of equivalent goods. But global trade is rarely balanced. Instead, the container became the physical ledger of a massive macroeconomic deficit. This chapter explores the strange logistics of trade imbalances and the billions of dollars spent shipping air back across the Pacific. The logic of the steel sovereign is predicated on the round trip. A shipping line makes its profit when a container is working, meaning it is under load. However, by the late 1990s, the consumer appetite of the West had far outpaced its industrial output. For every 3 containers that arrived at the port of Long Beach filled with high-value consumer goods, only 1 went back filled with exports. This left 2 empty boxes sitting on expensive Californian real estate. These ghosts represent the invisible tax of globalization. They take up space on ships, require fuel to move, and yet generate no revenue. They are the structural debris of a lopsided world, where the flow of physical goods only moves in one direction while the flow of capital moves in the other. This imbalance turned the shipping industry into a frantic game of musical chairs. Because it is often cheaper to ship a container back to China empty than to let it sit in a storage yard for weeks, the maritime world developed a shadow economy for empty boxes. At any given moment, roughly 20% to 25% of all containers on the world's oceans are completely empty. Shipping lines must pay for the repositioning of these ghosts, a cost that is ultimately passed on to the consumer. The container, once the symbol of efficiency, had become a symbol of the waste of distance. To manage this, shipping lines evolved into massive algorithmic engines, constantly calculating whether it is more profitable to pay storage rent in a high-cost port or freight fuel to move a hollow shell across a hemisphere. The hunt for backhaul cargo led to some of the strangest supply chains in history. To avoid shipping empty air, companies began looking for anything heavy and low value to fill the boxes heading back to Asia. This is why, for decades, one of the top exports from the United States to China was scrap paper and metal. American waste was containerized, shipped 8,000 miles, and recycled in Chinese factories to create the very packaging that would carry the next round of electronics back to the US. The box had created a literal circular economy, but one fueled by heavy fuel oil and thousands of miles of transit. This oddity effectively turned the Pacific into a conveyor belt for trash to treasure, where the waste of the West became the raw materials of the East, all subsidized by the cheapness of the return journey. This phenomenon also created a geographic paradox in the American interior. In hub cities like Chicago or Kansas City, the surplus of empty containers became so vast that they were repurposed into architecture, homes, offices, and swimming pools. The steel sovereign was literally overflowing into the landscape because the math of the global fortune dictated that it was cheaper to abandon a box in the Midwest than to pay the rail and sea freight to send it home. The box had become a disposable commodity in the very system that relied on its durability. In some regions, these steel shells became a form of industrial litter, stacked high in rural landscapes where the cost of moving them back to a coast exceeded their scrap value. The ghost of the empty box is the ultimate proof that the container has decoupled trade from value. In the breakbulk era, no one would have spent the labor and time to ship an empty crate across the ocean. But in the automated, intermodal world, the marginal cost of moving an empty unit is low enough that the system survives on its own inefficiency. We have built a world where shipping air is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is a haunting reminder that while the box solved the $5.83 problem, it could not solve the fundamental reality that some nations produce while others primarily consume. Today, the ghost remains the greatest challenge for logistical software. AI and predictive algorithms are now used to minimize empty miles, attempting to find new uses for boxes in a just-in-time world. But as long as the trade deficit exists, the steel ghosts will continue to haunt the waves. They are the silent witnesses to a global economy that is structurally lopsided, a world where the box is always moving, even when it has nothing left to say. In the original era of maritime trade, the fortune was dictated by the seasons. Strawberries were a summer luxury, and tropical fruits like bananas were rare treasures that often arrived at their destination as a bruised, fermented mess. The shipping container solved the problem of space, but it was the reefer, the refrigerated container, that solved the problem of time. By turning the standardized steel box into a high-tech, climate-controlled vault, the industry created a global cold chain that effectively eliminated the concept of a harvest season. This chapter explores how refrigerated gold transformed global diets and turned the grocery store into a year-round miracle of logistics. The technical challenge of the reefer was immense. A standard container is just a box, but a reefer is a complex machine. It requires a dedicated power source, precise thermal insulation, and advanced ventilation systems to manage the respiration of living cargo like fruit. In the early days of Sealand, McLean experimented with built-in cooling units, but the real breakthrough came with the integration of the box into the ship's electrical grid. Modern container ships are equipped with thousands of reefer plugs, turning the vessel into a massive, floating refrigerator. This allowed for atmospheric control, not just chilling the air, but managing the levels of oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide to slow down the ripening process of produce. This technological leap created a new kind of agricultural arbitrage. Suddenly, farmers in Chile, South Africa, and New Zealand could compete directly with local growers in Europe and North America. The steel sovereign allowed for the mass export of highly perishable goods, grapes, blueberries, asparagus, and salmon, across hemispheres. This transformed the economy of the southern hemispheres. Countries like Chile reinvented their entire national export strategy around the reefer, becoming the fruit basket of the world by shipping counter-seasonal produce to the snowy north. The box didn't just move products, it moved the sun, allowing consumers to eat summer fruit in the dead of winter. However, the reefer is more than just a tool for fruit, it is the backbone of the global protein trade. Before the refrigerated container, meat was shipped in specialized reefer ships that were difficult to load and unload. Today, frozen beef from Brazil or chilled lamb from New Zealand moves in standardized boxes that can be transferred directly to a truck or train without ever breaking the cold chain. This reliability has led to a massive increase in global meat consumption, as the cost of shipping frozen protein dropped by over 90%. The reefer turned a high-risk, specialized trade into a high-volume, standardized commodity market. It effectively commoditized the biological world, treating a side of beef with the same logistical indifference as a pallet of iPhones. The complexity of managing this refrigerated gold led to a massive investment in sensors and smart containers. Because a single reefer can hold over $100,000 worth of sensitive cargo, a power failure for even a few hours can result in a total loss. This pushed the industry toward the Internet of Things. Modern reefers are equipped with GPS and satellite-linked thermometers that allow a logistics manager in Rotterdam to monitor the temperature of a box of shrimp while it is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This level of oversight has reduced spoilage to nearly zero, creating a level of food security and variety that would have been unimaginable to the merchants of the breakbulk era. Yet, this convenience comes with a significant environmental and energetic cost. A reefer container consumes a vast amount of electricity compared to its dry counterparts, and the refrigerants used, HFCs, are potent greenhouse gases. Furthermore, the cold chain requires a continuous supply of energy from the moment the product leaves the farm until it reaches the consumer's plate. We have built a global food system that is entirely dependent on the cheap, reliable energy of the container network. The fortune of our modern diet is built on a foundation of high-maintenance steel, creating a fragility of freshness that we only notice when the power fails or the ships stop moving. The reefer also changed the retail landscape. The modern supermarket, with its vast aisles of exotic, year-round produce, is a direct byproduct of the refrigerated box. The seasonal diet has been replaced by the logistical diet. We no longer eat what is growing nearby, we eat what is moving through the cold chain. This has led to the homogenization of food, as varieties are chosen not for their flavor, but for their ability to withstand 20 days in a standardized steel box. The steel sovereign has dictated the very taste of our food, prioritizing durability and aesthetics over local nuance. This chapter highlights that the container didn't just conquer the dry goods market, it colonized the biological world. By mastering the cold, the industry completed the universalization of trade. There is now almost nothing that cannot be boxed, stacked, and shipped across the planet. The reefer is the ultimate expression of the just-in-time world, a system where the harvest never ends and the shelves are never empty. But as the system grew more complex, the need for human oversight began to fade, giving way to the next stage of the revolution, the rise of the machine-managed harbor. By the turn of the millennium, the steel sovereign had outpaced the capacity of the human mind to manage it. In a world where a single megaship can carry over 20,000 containers, the logistics of loading and unloading, deciding which box goes where to ensure the ship remains balanced and the most urgent cargo is accessible, became a mathematical problem of staggering complexity. The solution was the transition from the manual dock to the algorithmic port. This chapter explores how the chaos of the waterfront was replaced by the silent, cold precision of LiDAR, software, and autonomous machines. This digital evolution represents the final victory of logic over the unpredictable physical labor that once defined the maritime world. The modern automated terminal, such as Rotterdam's Maasvlakte 2 or Singapore's Tuas port, looks less like a harbor and more like a giant, outdoor computer chip. In these environments, human beings are almost entirely absent from the active zone. Instead, the work is performed by automated guided vehicles, AGVs, robotic platforms that navigate using magnets embedded in the concrete or high-precision GPS. These machines move with a ghostly, pre-programmed intent, carrying 40-ton boxes to and from the cranes without ever needing a coffee break or a shift change. The fortune of the port is no longer found in the strength of a longshoreman's back, but in the efficiency of the code that coordinates the dance. At the heart of this system is the Terminal Operating System, TOS, the brain of the harbor. The TOS uses complex algorithms to solve the stowage problem. Every container has a specific weight, destination, and priority level. A container full of refrigerated gold must be placed near a power outlet, while a container destined for a rail transfer in the next port must be easily accessible. The algorithm must calculate the optimal Tetris move for every single box, minimizing the number of rehandles. In an algorithmic port, a second saved per move translates into millions of dollars in annual profit. The human element has been relegated to a control room miles away, where operators monitor screens like air traffic controllers, intervening only when the sensors detect an anomaly. This shift has effectively completed the dehumanization of the waterfront that began with Malcolm McLean's first voyage. In the 1950s, the port was a place of noise, sweat, and community. Today, it is a sterile, fenced-off industrial fortress. The steel sovereign has demanded an environment tailored entirely to its own needs: perfectly flat surfaces, constant electricity, and absolute predictability. For the worker, this has meant a final shift from labor to technical oversight. The remaining jobs are highly skilled, maintenance of the robotics and software debugging, but the mass employment that once defined port cities is a thing of the past. The container didn't just automate the move, it automated the economy of the coastline, fundamentally severing the ancient social bond between the city and its sea. However, the algorithmic port introduces a new kind of vulnerability: cyber fragility. In 2017, the NotPetya malware attack paralyzed the global shipping giant Maersk, shutting down its automated terminals and forcing the company to revert to manual ledgers and whiteboards. The system was so optimized for digital speed that it had no analog backup. When the algorithms went dark, the world's supply chain stopped. This highlights the efficiency paradox. The more we optimize the fortune through automation, the more we expose ourselves to systemic collapse from a single line of bad code. We have traded the physical friction of the docks for the invisible friction of the network. The use of LiDAR and computer vision on ship-to-shore cranes has further pushed the limits of productivity. These cranes can now see the corner castings of a container through fog or rain, locking on with a precision that no human operator could match. This allows ports to operate 24/7, regardless of weather conditions, maximizing the throughput of the global conveyor belt. The port is no longer a destination, it is a high-speed processing node where the goal is to keep the box in motion. If a container sits still for more than a few hours, the algorithm views it as a failure of the system. This chapter concludes with the realization that the container has successfully standardized the mind of the industry. We no longer ask how to move a box, but how to move it faster using less human intervention. The algorithmic port is the ultimate expression of Malcolm McLean's vision, a world where the movement of goods is as seamless and thoughtless as the flow of water through a pipe. But as we will see in the next chapter, even the most perfect algorithm cannot account for the unpredictable physicality of the Earth, leading to a spectacular breakdown at the world's most famous choke point. For decades, the steel sovereign was praised for its invisibility and efficiency. We lived in a world where the just-in-time system was so perfect that we forgot the physical constraints of the planet. But in March 2021, the world received a brutal reminder of the physicality of trade when the Ever Given, a 220,000-ton ultra-large container vessel, became wedged across the Suez Canal. This chapter examines the Ever Given event not as a freak accident, but as the inevitable consequence of an industry that prioritized scale over resilience, creating a global choke point that could be paralyzed by a single gust of wind. This moment exposed the terrifying reality that our entire global civilization was built on a foundation of perfect conditions that the Earth was no longer guaranteed to provide. The Ever Given was a product of the post-Panamax arms race described in Chapter 14. At 400 meters long, it was literally too large for the environment it was navigating. When a dust storm and high winds caught the ship's massive sail area, the thousands of stacked containers acting like a giant sheet of steel, the vessel was pushed off course and grounded its bow in the canal's sandy bank. In an instant, 12% of global trade stopped. The celestial fortune was held hostage by a literal sandbar. The image of the tiny excavator trying to dig out the massive hull became a global metaphor for the hubris of modern logistics. We had built machines that were too big for our infrastructure to manage when things went wrong. The sheer scale of the ship meant that even the most advanced tugboats in the world looked like toys against its gargantuan, unyielding steel flank. This was the moment the industrialization of distance hit a physical wall, proving that no amount of algorithmic optimization could overcome the basic geometry of a narrow waterway and a massive hull. The blockage triggered a bullwhip effect that rippled through the global economy. Because the world had embraced just-in-time manufacturing, there were no buffer stocks to absorb the delay. Factories in Europe began to shut down because they were missing specific components held in boxes 3 miles behind the Ever Given. The ghost of the empty box returned with a vengeance, as the blockage prevented empty containers from returning to Asia, leading to a global shortage that sent freight rates soaring from $2,000 to over $20,000 per container. The system was so tightly coupled that a single stuck ship caused a systemic cardiac arrest. This event proved that the efficiency Malcolm McLean sought had reached a point of diminishing returns, where the cost of a single failure could wipe out years of marginal gains. Every hour the ship remained stuck, billions of dollars in trade evaporated, proving that our frictionless world was actually highly susceptible to physical blockages. This crisis also exposed the consolidation trap. As discussed in Chapter 11, the industry had merged into a few mega-alliances using megaships. While this lowered the cost of a t-shirt by a few cents, it concentrated the world's risk into fewer, larger vessels. If 10 smaller ships had been moving that cargo, a single grounding would have been a minor delay. With one giant ship, it was a global catastrophe. The steel sovereign had become a single point of failure. The Ever Given was a black swan that revealed the fragility of the box, a reminder that our high-tech, algorithmic world still rests on the ancient, narrow, and shallow mud of the Earth's geography. The quest for massiveness had created a monster that the world's narrowest arteries could no longer safely accommodate. The aftermath of the blockage led to a profound re-evaluation of globalization. For the first time in the container era, companies began to speak of just-in-case instead of just-in-time. There was a renewed interest in nearshoring, moving factories closer to home to reduce reliance on long, fragile maritime pipelines. The fortune was no longer just about the lowest cost, but about the highest resilience. The Ever Given served as a warning. The box had conquered distance, but it had not conquered the Earth. We had built a world of infinite demand on a planet of finite channels, and the steel sovereign had finally met its match in the narrowest of places. This reckoning forced a shift in boardroom priorities, as reliability replaced cost per unit as the most vital metric of the 2020s. This chapter concludes with the irony of the Ever Given's release. It took a massive effort of salvage experts, tugboats, and a favorable high tide, the most ancient of maritime forces, to free the most modern of machines. The algorithmic port was useless as long as the ship was in the mud. The event signaled the end of the era of unquestioned scale. While ships continue to grow, the industry now operates with a new sense of logistical anxiety. We now understand that the box is only as good as the narrowest point in its journey. The fortune of the future will belong to those who can build a bendy supply chain, one that can absorb the shock when the giants of the sea inevitably stumble again. For half a century, the shipping container was celebrated as the ultimate efficiency machine, but that efficiency was bought with a heavy, hidden currency, carbon and sulfur. While the steel sovereign allowed for the industrialization of distance, it did so by utilizing the cheapest, dirtiest fuel on the planet, bunker fuel. As the world entered the 2020s, the fortune of global trade faced a moral and regulatory reckoning. This chapter explores the environmental cost of the box and the industry's high-stakes pivot toward a green horizon. This transition represents the most significant challenge to the container's dominance since its inception, as the industry must now decouple global prosperity from ecological destruction. The scale of the problem is as massive as the ships themselves. The global shipping industry is responsible for approximately 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. However, for decades, shipping remained the invisible polluter. Because these vessels operate in international waters, they largely escape the strict environmental regulations imposed on land-based industries. The industry relied on heavy fuel oil, HFO, a viscous, tar-like residue of the refining process. A single megaship at full steam can emit as much sulfur oxide as millions of cars, contributing to acid rain and respiratory illnesses in port cities. This environmental debt, accumulated over decades of unchecked growth, has finally reached a point where the global community can no longer afford to ignore the black plumes trailing behind the world's wealth. The environmental ledger finally came due in 2020 with the implementation of IMO 2020, a global mandate by the International Maritime Organization to slash sulfur content in marine fuels by 80%. This sent shockwaves through the celestial fortune. Shipping lines were forced to choose between two expensive paths: switching to more refined, costly low-sulfur fuel or installing scrubbers, massive systems that wash the soot out of the smoke before it leaves the funnel. This was the first time in the history of the box that the logic of the lowest cost was superseded by the logic of the environment. The era of externalizing the cost of pollution to the oceans was drawing to a close. However, sulfur was only the beginning. The industry is now facing an even greater challenge: decarbonization. The quest for zero-emission shipping has triggered a new technological arms race. Giants like Maersk are betting on green methanol, while others are exploring ammonia or hydrogen. Some designers have even looked back to the past, proposing wind-assisted propulsion using high-tech, automated sails that look more like airplane wings than traditional canvas. The box, which was born from a trucker's desire to save time, is now being redesigned to save the climate. This shift is driving a radical reinvention of maritime engineering, turning ships into floating laboratories for renewable energy. The green transition is also changing the geography of the fortune. To produce these new green fuels, the industry needs massive amounts of renewable energy. This is creating new logistical hubs in places like Chile, Egypt, and Australia. The container is no longer just a vessel for consumer goods, it is becoming a vessel for the energy transition. The steel sovereign is being forced to shed its industrial-age skin and become a digital-age ecological steward. This shift is not just about fuel, it's about a total reimagining of the supply chain, moving from a system that ignores its externalities to one that accounts for every gram of carbon. Yet, there is a fundamental tension in this green ledger. The container thrives on volume and speed, both of which are energy-intensive. As we move toward a world of slow steaming, where ships reduce their speed to save fuel, the just-in-time world is being forced to slow down. We are discovering that the efficiency of the box was built on the assumption that the environment was a free resource. As we put a price on carbon, the arbitrage of the box becomes harder to justify. If a t-shirt costs $5 to make and $1 to ship, but $2 in carbon taxes to move across the ocean, the math of globalization begins to break. The steel sovereign may have conquered the world, but it is now finding that the cost of maintaining that empire in a warming world is higher than predicted. This chapter highlights that the environmental crisis is the ultimate friction point for the box. Malcolm McLean solved the $5.83 problem of manual labor, but the industry is now facing the carbon problem, which cannot be solved with better cranes or bigger ships alone. It requires a fundamental shift in how we value the planet's resources. The container turned the world into a single factory, but that factory is now being told it can no longer dump its waste into the atmosphere for free. The fortune of the future is no longer just about moving goods, it's about moving them without leaving a trace. As the industry grapples with its green future, it must also confront the human cost of its total dominance. The steel sovereign didn't just change the climate, it changed the very nature of work and the people who perform it. In our penultimate chapter, we will look at the sailors of the box, the invisible workforce that keeps the global conveyor belt moving, often at a profound personal cost. The shipping container's ultimate triumph is its own disappearance. Today, the steel sovereign is so successful that it has become a ghost in the machinery of modern life, an invisible box that we only notice when it stops moving. Malcolm McLean's legacy is a world where geography has been defeated by geometry. This final chapter examines the dual-edged sword of the container revolution, how it successfully shrank the planet into a single global village while simultaneously stretching our supply chains to a point of unprecedented, hair-trigger fragility. The container's greatest trick was the compression of distance. By reducing the cost of shipping to a negligible rounding error, the box effectively moved Shanghai closer to Los Angeles than Los Angeles is to Chicago. In the pre-container era, the cost of moving goods was a barrier that protected local industries. The handling tax acted as a natural tariff. McLean's invention demolished that wall. This small world phenomenon allowed for a level of cultural and economic exchange never before seen in human history. The fortune was no longer restricted to those within reach of a local market. The box democratized access to the world's goods, allowing a consumer in a remote village to buy the same electronics as a resident of Manhattan. However, this shrinking of the world came at a hidden cost. The supply chain elongation. We traded the security of local production for the efficiency of the global pipeline. We live in a world where a simple product, like a toaster or a smartphone, depends on components crossing the ocean a dozen times before reaching a kitchen counter. This elongation has moved the point of production thousands of miles away from the point of consumption, making the average consumer utterly oblivious to the origin of their lives. The box didn't just move goods. It moved our understanding of labor, environment, and cost out of sight and out of mind. This legacy has created a fundamental paradox. We are more connected than ever, yet we are more vulnerable to the distance we claim to have conquered. The invisible box has encouraged us to build a world with zero margin for error. In our quest for the celestial fortune, we stripped away the slop in the system, the warehouses, the extra inventory, and the local suppliers, replacing them with a high-speed, just-in-time conveyor belt that spans hemispheres. As the steel sovereign enters its 8th decade, the industry is shifting from a blind pursuit of lowest cost toward a new philosophy of resilience. Recent global shocks have proven that a supply chain spanning 12,000 miles is not a miracle of efficiency if it cannot survive a single week of disruption. The invisible box is finally becoming visible again as we realize that the standardization of everything also means the synchronization of failure. If the box stops, the world stops. McLean's vision was one of pure, mechanical efficiency, but the legacy of the box includes a complex human and ethical ledger. The dehumanization of the waterfront and the plight of the invisible sailor are the shadows cast by the container's success. We have built a world of infinite variety and low prices on the backs of a workforce that remains largely unseen, operating under flags of convenience in a legal gray zone of the high seas. Furthermore, the environmental cost of this invisible trade is no longer a debt that can be deferred. The box made the world smaller, but it also made the environmental footprint of our consumption much larger. The future of the box lies in making these invisible costs visible once more, understanding the human, environmental, and geopolitical realities hidden inside every corrugated steel wall. This transformation forces us to confront a difficult truth. The convenience we enjoy is predicated on a system that prioritizes the flow of things over the stability of places. By dissolving borders for cargo, we inadvertently dissolved the self-sufficiency of nations. The container created a hyper-interdependent reality where a strike in a European port or a drought in the Panama Canal ripples through the aisles of a supermarket in the American Midwest. We are now tasked with reconciling this incredible logistical reach with a world that demands ethical transparency and ecological limits. The invisible box must become a conscious one, transitioning from a mere vessel of trade into a benchmark for a more responsible form of global citizenship. Malcolm McLean did not just change how we move things, he changed how we perceive the earth. He turned the wild, unpredictable oceans into a standardized, predictable grid. The invisible box is the foundation upon which the modern world is built, a silent testament to the power of a simple, sturdy idea. As we look to the final horizon, the container remains the only currency that truly matters in the global fortune. It made the world smaller, our lives more abundant, and our dependencies more complex. It is the box that built the world, and it is the box that will define our future. The sovereign still reigns, but its kingdom is now one of data, carbon, and the desperate need for a new kind of balance. The box has reached its final form, a ghost that carries the weight of a civilization. Thank you for traveling through the waters with us. Our next episode moves from the salty seas to the salt on your table. If you enjoyed this journey, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and we'll see you next week.